A common image surrounding the Russian Revolution is the revolutionaries fighting not just the White armies, but against the whole of the capitalist world. This has taken on a life on its own in popular history, and in alternate histories it is common to see discussion on the Entente staging a larger intervention, or the Germans winning in the West and then intervening to allow the Whites to win. Yet at least part of this view was based on Bolshevik propaganda, fueled by actual fears of the Entente following their victory over the Germans, sending their massive armies against the Reds. But if we examine what the Entente actually sent, such a view is over-exaggerated. There is no doubt that the Entente, on paper, had the strength to destroy Bolshevism at this early stage. But as we will soon explore, in practice, their interventions were minor, cautious, targeted and troubled. And the idea to just go and restore the Whites to power was a lot more complicated than it may initially seem. So let's look at the position of the Bolsheviks in 1918. Upon coming to power, their position was very feeble. At any point, a German invasion, a counter-revolution, or Entente intervention could threaten their revolution. Meanwhile, they had promised food, significant land reforms, and above all, peace to the population. Balancing the various interests amongst the internal factions was difficult enough, but they also had to balance relations with the Germans and the Entente, despite actually despising both sides. To achieve peace, the Bolsheviks had to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, giving up immense territories, notably including most of the Russian Empire's industrial resources, dealing a crippling blow to the nation already weakened by war. Beyond that, monetary and resource demands were also placed on Russia. This treaty, while ending the war, also caused a rift between various factions of the revolution. As some argued, the war should have been continued until a German revolution broke out, at which point world revolution could be achieved. But as peace won out, the Bolsheviks were forced to appease Berlin significantly, growing increasingly dependent on them and fearing at any point renewed German aggression. This awkward German-Bolshevik relationship characterized the early stages of Entente intervention in 1918, where chiefly they occupied the eastern port of Vladivostok and the northern port of Arkhangelsk. These early interventions were not aimed at destroying Bolshevism. While some, like Winston Churchill, suggested toppling the Bolsheviks, most of the leadership still disagreed. When these interventions occurred, World War I was still ongoing, and while we know the Central Powers were to collapse by the end of the year, there was no clear evidence of this. As far as the Allied High Command was concerned, the war could last at least a year longer, while financial issues were compounding and fear of social unrest was rising even amongst the Entente powers. These early interventions then should largely be explained in relation to the war against Germany. Arkhangelsk and Vladivostok had major Entente weapon depots, previously used to supply their Tsarist ally. These interventions were meant to secure them. There was also the Czechoslovak Legion, who were stuck in Russia, and the Entente hoped to clear a way out for them. Another motivation for the intervention was to gain leverage over the Bolshevik leaders, as there was fear amongst some that the Bolsheviks may ally with the Germans, or at least fight a parallel conflict in Asia. These interventions were meant to dissuade the Bolsheviks from such steps. There was also faint hope of restarting the Eastern Front in some way, either through facilitating a White Russian counter-revolution, or even through convincing Lenin to continue or rejoin the war against the Germans. Such an unholy alliance may sound crazy, but again, the focus was simply on the war against Germany, and ending this conflict as swiftly as possible. But when the Germans finally collapsed, Entente priorities were allowed to change. Suddenly, they could re-evaluate their goals in Russia. The Entente were now a legitimate threat for the future of the revolution. After all, the Red Army at its peak commanded about 5.5 million soldiers. France alone had more than 8, the British Empire another 9, and the US more than 4. Though if they wanted to, they could field many, many more. Entente soldiers were also generally better trained and better equipped, and it should be clear that, on paper, if the Entente went on a full anti-Bolshevik crusade, their victory is near secure. Yet still, serious interventions did not happen. Sure, the British maintained their position in the north, the French had a little adventure in Ukraine, and the Japanese bolstered their position in the Far East, but that was that. On paper, around 250,000 forces intervened, but 70,000 of those were Japanese, far away from actual fighting. Another 50,000 were the Czechoslovaks, who simply wanted to leave and were not committed to ensuring a White Russian victory. The Entente forces which were present never participated in any major battles. In fact, we saw these campaigns become increasingly troubled. The French entered Ukraine expecting to find local allies and liberate the nation, before easily toppling the weak Bolsheviks. Instead, they found a well-organized, prepared Bolshevik army, a population hostile to their presence, and their own soldiers questioned the very purpose of this invasion and even mutinied. After all, these men were supposed to fight the Germans, a war they had understood and a war that was now over. But instead of going home, they were sent to a strange land, fighting for unknown reasons. For all Entente interventions, morale amongst the soldiers was low and rates of mutiny were high. Indirect aid was more substantial, with notably a blockade imposed on the Bolsheviks and attempts made to facilitate contact and cooperation between various white and independent armies. Yet, the failure of the opposition to lay aside their differences and agree on a unified political program, or even choose a single leader, greatly frustrated the Allies. It became difficult for them to see who they were supporting. What kind of a Russia were they even fighting for? Especially for the Americans, they had no interest in the conflict if it would result in a new absolute monarchy. Beyond that, material aid did make their way to the White Armies, mostly excess equipment from the war in Europe. But why? Why did the Entente choose not to intervene? They certainly had lots of reason to, even beyond the obvious fear of communism. France had interest in the Ukraine, hoping to add it to their growing alliance network in Eastern Europe and gain access to the region's coal resources. Britain had hoped to extend their Middle Eastern sphere into the Caucasus, primarily to gain control over the Baku oil fields. In the east, Japan was eyeing up Sakhalin and other spheres or conquests in Siberia. Beyond territorial goals, Russia had been in a lot of debt. To Britain and the US, primarily due to the costs of World War I, and to the French, because they had, in the years before the war, readily provided loans for industrialization and the modernization of Russia's armies and infrastructure. As such, the Entente governments wanted these back, or at least some form of compensation for these investments. The communists had made it no secret that they planned to default on these loans, so the only real hope of recovering their investments would be a White Russian victory. Even better, with the nation in ruin and in immense debt, this new Russia would then be completely dependent on the West. But it's not as easy as it seemed. By the time of the German collapse, the Bolsheviks had the time to entrench themselves. They controlled most of the heartland and the population centers of Russia. The White Armies were divided, infighting, and on the periphery. The main white leaders were all nationalistic and conservatives, either promising views of Russia the West were not enthusiastic about, or were so vague in their political positions that they were simply not trusted by the West to set up a responsible government. Invading Russia without even knowing which faction you are supporting and what kind of a regime is being formed after is a major risk the Entente was not interested in. And especially President Wilson was very clear that any aid had to be conditional on many democratic and economic reforms being enacted in this new Russia. Ignoring this political issue, if we assume the Entente did decide to go for a more direct intervention, the question is then raised, where would you launch it from? Supplying any such intervention from Vladivostok is difficult, and could turn into a disaster if the Trans-Siberian Railway was somehow sabotaged. Moving from Iran is impossible due to lacking infrastructure, while Arkhangelsk was a single port open to sabotage, but also froze over completely in winter. Arguably the most viable route for a large invasion force was through Poland, but this was also a pipe dream. You would need to pass through recently defeated Germany, which was sure to cause an uproar there, to then move into Poland and invade Eastern Europe. You then have to face the resistance from the other nationalities, fighting your way slowly to Moscow. Aside from the general madness of this plan, even Poland wouldn't be interested. They had far-reaching ambitions in Eastern Europe, and getting the Entente involved would almost certainly destroy those. We also cannot ignore the sheer war weariness of Europe itself. When Austria declared war on Serbia, few would have imagined the horrors that awaited the continent. Now, Germany was defeated 4 years later, and the soldiers and populations could finally hope for a return to normalcy. You can imagine that sending these soldiers to Russia will not be popular. World War I was devastating, and it was felt that the populations of Europe were at a breaking point. But at least, World War I was a conflict the population had understood. This was not the case in Russia. Yes, the French state and the rich bankers of the Entente benefited from the overthrow of the Bolsheviks and feared the rise of communism. But why did your average Peare care? Again, this caused many mutinies amongst Entente forces shipped to Russia. There was also the major risk that the war in Russia could drag. There was no guarantee that any invasion would be a clean sweep, over in a matter of months. Getting stuck in another years-long conflict was something no Entente government had an appetite for. Wilson and the Americans didn't want a larger intervention anyway, preferring to leave it up to the Russians. Also, he distrusted the imperial ambitions of his European allies. Britain itself was broke, and in 1919 officially introduced the 10-year rule, mandating much lower military spending in an effort to recover from the costs of World War I, specifically including a commitment to not get involved in other major wars. A prominent slogan for this bill was, "We are not staying in Russia." The benefits of intervention were also smaller than I made them seem before. The Bolsheviks were feared, yes, but in 1919 it didn't seem like they were in a position to lead the world revolution. Yes, the Entente wanted their money back, but as the Bolsheviks had entrenched their position, it became clear that the investments needed to achieve regime change would likely be larger than the benefits extracted from a nation destroyed by war. The biggest Russian cities had already declined by more than 50%, and that was before the hypothetical battles for Moscow and Petrograd which would need to be fought. Especially considering the territories the Entente wanted to strip away from Russia, there was just little hope that a new White Russia would be able to repay much of their debt. In light of all of these arguments, the Entente strategy of our timeline makes a lot of sense. Don't risk a major invasion, which could heighten social tensions, cause mutinies, and would be very expensive, and instead rely primarily on the white and nationalist armies on the ground. Such a strategy was low risk, high reward. In the worst case, the Bolsheviks win anyways. This is sad, but also mostly expected. All you have lost is soon to be outdated excess equipment. You still have the possibility to build up relations with the Soviets, as let's face it, there is nobody else for them to turn to. Best case, your minimal support does clutch the Whites a victory in some form. Now, you can leverage this minimal support and your control over global finance to extract concessions from the new regime. There was even a stipulation in Versailles that, at any point, the Entente could include the Russians in German reparation payments. Undoubtedly a provision meant to, hopefully, stabilize the White Russian economy after a victory. So in conclusion, the Entente had a lot of reason to topple the Bolsheviks, but also a lot of reasons not to. The easiest interventions, militarily speaking, are simply overshadowed by World War I. The risk of an intervention driving the Russians into closer partnership with Germany was a risk too big to take when it wasn't clear when Germany may collapse. When World War I was over, the benefits of toppling the Bolsheviks were countered by many disadvantages, from war weariness and social unrest in the home countries to the financial cost of such interventions, to mutinies from a military that did not understand the conflict and most of all just wanted to go home. At the end of the day, the Entente was not going to intervene to save White Russia. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. But that leads us to alternate history. If the Entente didn't directly intervene to save the Whites, surely the Germans would. United behind a common cause of monarchical conservatism and disdain for the communist ideology, the Germans and the Whites seem like natural allies. Well, there is some truth to this, and the odds of Germany intervening directly are far higher. But it likely isn't in the way you might be imagining. Now first, some setup. How we let the Germans achieve their victory is not all too important, except the timing matters. Obviously, if we let the Germans win through something like the Schlieffen Plan, the October Revolution has not occurred yet. At the earliest, the Germans can win the war after November of 1917. This also means that any victory, by definition, is hard fought, coming after years of conflict. So, while Germany is successful in humiliating the West and reshaping the East in their image, it is important to remember the Germans would likewise be exhausted by conflict. The military had cemented their position in government in a pseudo-dictatorship, and the economy had been cannibalized. Before we wonder how Germany may position itself towards Russia after a victory, we can wonder how they interacted after Brest-Litovsk in our timeline. Initially, the focus lay on consolidating the territories they had recently occupied, most notably Ukraine, which they hoped could provide the resources necessary for Germany to continue the war with the West. Yet, due to Ukrainian resistance and fears of a renewed Eastern Front, about 500,000 soldiers were still in Ukraine alone. Germany was also competing over influence in the Caucasus, primarily for those Baku oil fields again, and an expedition was prepared into Finland to install a German prince there. For the German Foreign Office, their desire was mainly to keep relations with the Bolsheviks steady, so Eastern Europe was as stable as possible, considering the circumstances, and the military could focus on ending the war in the West. But once the West was defeated, German priorities could well shift. For the Entente, Russia was an afterthought. Sure, it posed some long-term threats, but there was a whole continent in between. Germany does not have that luxury, and even after a victory in the West, a large force would need to remain mobilized in the East. And the Germans would need to, in some form, position themselves regarding the Russian Civil War before they can truly demobilize and declare a full victory. If they don't, especially considering their satellite regimes are extremely unpopular amongst the population, they run the risk of getting involved into an Eastern European forever war. In light of this, would a German invasion of Russia be beneficial to them? Well, quite possibly. But much like with the Entente, it does come with a lot of risk. The German economic and social situation was deteriorating fast in 1918. And while a victory in the West would alleviate a lot of pressure, going right into a new war could still be a major mistake. Still, compared to the Democratic Entente, the autocratic Germany has a better shot at rallying their nation for this invasion, especially because Russia has always been propagandized as the main enemy during and before the war. Of course, while Germany is very well positioned for strikes against Petrograd and Moscow, they still can expect a long slog and guerrilla campaign if they do try. German plans to topple the Bolsheviks were already discussed during World War I, and here it is interesting to look at their goals, their ambitions, and who they might want in power after a victory. Important surrounding the discussions over intervention were if any other Russian faction would be more beneficial to the Germans than the Bolsheviks were. From a German perspective, communism was ideologically bankrupt, destined to fail. They were in an active civil war, their industrial base was destroyed, and they even partially relied on the Germans for food shipments to their major cities. It had also been the Bolsheviks which actually signed Brest-Litovsk, paying the war indemnities to Germany and legitimizing their territorial gains. Installing another faction would only benefit Germany if they knew these new factions wouldn't try to reverse German gains. Here I think it is interesting to look into direct sources from the German Foreign Ministry. We have several communications during the Civil War, and predominant in these discussions was a fear of Russia restarting hostilities, whether that be through the Bolsheviks or through a White Russian victory. Between those two options, the consensus was that a White Russian victory was actually more of a threat to Germany. This is partially because of Russia's traditional alliance with the West, but also, again, because Germany considered communism to be flawed, and feared that a White Russia would fare better economically. It is interesting to note that by this point, in July of 1918, the Germans were still planning in terms of years. By this point, the thought that Germany may lose the war was not even seriously considered. Another significant issue for Germany was Ukraine. They had a lot of trouble holding on to the territory, and they even discussed that Ukraine may be an artificial state, fearing it may drift back to Russia, whichever regime won out. This obviously threatened to reduce German influence in the region. For the Foreign Office, the solution was clear: renegotiate the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and more important than territorial gains or war indemnities was economic control over Russia itself. This was something we saw all across German plans for Eastern Europe. Besides the proposed annexation of the Polish Strip, Germany on the whole organized their gains in a string of satellites from Finland to Romania, with various degrees of German oversight. Controlling things like the railways, infrastructure, resources and the food supply were far more important for true control over these regions. Especially for a nation as large as Russia, if Germany could indeed take control over those institutions, it mattered little which regime officially called itself the government of Russia. Thus, for the Foreign Office, the Bolsheviks were not a threat. Communism was destined to fall anyways, whether through internal collapse or simply because its leaders would abandon their radical ideas voluntarily in favor of economic ties to Germany. Convincing, threatening and blackmailing the Bolsheviks into conceding more economic powers to the Germans over time was considered a totally valid route to German hegemony in Eastern Europe. Interestingly, the Foreign Office did discuss that there may, at some point, come a reason to invade and topple the Bolsheviks. But in doing so, they suggested not aligning to the White armies, but instead installing their own figure into power. Much like how they had supported Skoropadsky to rule over Ukraine. But why did the Germans not want to cooperate with the Whites, despite very obvious ideological similarities, both being conservative, if not reactionary monarchists? Well, before World War I, Russia had been Germany's primary enemy. German propaganda in the war overwhelmingly showed the brave Germanics holding off the Russian horde. Now, after 3 years of fighting between the two sides, the same Russian generals which fought the Germans now led the White armies. The rallying cry these Russian generals used was Russia, one and indivisible. Obviously, such a goal was mutually exclusive with the territorial gains Germany had just won. While some German-White cooperation is absolutely possible, it may be difficult for Berlin to find a prominent White Russian general willing to, in essence, submit himself to Germany. Rallying the entire White coalition behind a German vision for Russia is just not going to happen. Thus, if Germany does choose to intervene, and does indeed win, this does not lead to a White Russian victory as we often imagine it. For example, in Kaiserreich, portraying a sovereign and even democratic Russia, capable of, after a few decades of rebuilding, participate against the Germans in the next World War. Germany has absolutely no benefit in restoring a Russian empire as it existed before 1914. Instead, whoever the Germans find to lead their Russian government, they will be expected to pay for their victory with nothing less than the subservience of the country's economy and infrastructure to Germany. But what I have described so far were the opinions of the Foreign Ministry. There were some amongst the High Command who recommended a much more aggressive course of action, notable amongst which Ludendorff, who had been turned into something of a military dictator. He was a staunch German ultranationalist, believing the Germans the master race destined to rule over Europe, and he had been a major proponent of territorial annexations in Eastern Europe, blocking attempts by the Foreign Office and industrialists to annex fewer territories from Russia and instead focus on the economic concessions I discussed earlier. He also hated socialism and considered the Reds a geopolitical and internal threat. The Socialist Party in Germany had been rising fast, and the conservatives and reactionaries feared that these socialists may just try to launch a German revolution too, bringing Europe close to an overall socialist victory. In this light, it was considered a major risk for them to normalize the Bolsheviks and let them consolidate power. Interestingly, Ludendorff had considered war against the Bolsheviks even during World War I. The Reds had reached out to Germany, suggesting joint action against the Entente in Arkhangelsk. The militarists considered using this invitation as a cover, and instead capturing Petrograd, the revolutionary capital. Brian Pearce argues that it may well have been the failures of the German Spring Offensive and subsequent Entente advances that led the militarists to abandon this plan, as the situation on the Western Front was now so dire, Germany couldn't spare any soldiers. This allowed the much more moderate view of the Foreign Ministry to, at least for now, prevail, and the Bolsheviks were tolerated for as long as it benefited the Germans. Therefore, it may well be important when the Germans achieve their victory in the West when discussing their policies towards Russia. The longer the war takes, the more costly it is, the bigger the chance that the moderates may come out on top. At least until a clear motive for intervention is found, or enough time has passed for Germany to consider going to war again. Yet, the earlier the victory is achieved, the bigger the chance Ludendorff and his militarists indeed commit to something like a surprise attack on Petrograd, inserting the Germans directly into the civil war in hopes of making absolute their hegemony in Eastern Europe. Of course, the question on if Germany would even be successful is still an open one, and I lean very strongly towards no. Even after a victory, the population was suffering a famine, the soldiers were sick of war, the nation was on the brink of revolution. Even with the jubilance of victory, an untimed rallying cry to war would be very dangerous for the Germans, especially because we cannot assume an easy victory in Russia, and Germany will be in for a long and drawn out guerrilla conflict. In the absolute worst case scenario for Germany, we may see them attempting such a conflict, only to demoralize their armies in an Eastern European forever war and further anger the socialists within Germany itself. Beyond that, all the German puppet regimes in Eastern Europe were unstable, unpopular strongmen, only propped up by German armies. And any war is likely to strengthen pre-existing resistance movements. Of course, you also can't ignore the risk of Austro-Hungarian dissolution, even in the aftermath of an overall victory. There's also the risk of an Entente declaration of war, or worst of all, a straight up German revolution. While all of these happening all at once is a bit much. These are all very real red flags for the Germans attempting such an invasion. Ludendorff forcing an invasion of Russia may well be the cause of the downfall of German hegemony before it properly began. On the whole, the Germans would do well to balance their interests. Eastern European policy was very fluid, and divide and conquer is the name of the game. For the Foreign Office, the focus was on the economic side of things, trying to stabilize Eastern Europe in whatever way possible, and trying to slowly but steadily expand German influence into Russia proper. In that view, so long as the Bolsheviks collaborated with the Germans, there was no reason for a military intervention. That being said, imagining the conservative Germans and the communists remain on good footing for long is difficult. But at the very least, they may succeed in pushing back an invasion of Russia by years, rather than during or immediately after the conclusion of World War I. Even on the matters of borders, the Foreign Office was remarkably flexible. I doubt that they could have convinced the militarists to go for it, but returning Ukraine to Moscow, whichever regime ended up victorious, under the condition of significant economic concessions, wouldn't be a bad plan. But even if the militarists do win out, the Germans are unlikely to intervene on the sides of the whites as we traditionally know them. Any intervention would explicitly be an attempt by Germany to crown their conquest of Eastern Europe with the greatest prize of them all, the subjugation of Great Russia to the whims of Berlin. So, in conclusion, German-Bolshevik relations in a German victory scenario are rather fascinating, and way more complicated than I may have presumed before making this video. While methods differed, the focus of the primary factions within Germany was the same: the subjugation of Russia to Germany. The specific methods this was achieved by depends on which faction ends up dominating foreign policy after World War I, as well as how long the war lasted and how exhausted Germany is afterwards. In any case, such a conflict will be long and drawn out, and an uncareful Germany may yet throw away all of their gains. For the Germans, the question of the Russian Civil War was fundamentally different than for the Entente. The conflict was less ideological, less based on hypothetical fears of what a Bolshevik Russia may become. What mattered was advancing Germany's interests in the state, and in this, the White Russians did not inherently offer the Germans a significantly better deal. So, in any case, the Germans had no intention to come and save White Russia. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.